Feels good to sit down.
So thanks to you all for being here. I'm Patrick Malloy. I'm a scholar of Christian ritual and the dean of this cathedral, and the fit for tonight is a penguin suit. Of course you know Dan. You wouldn't be here if it weren't for Dan.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Let me say something about how this happened. So when the Dobbs decision came down, I realized that the next probable target of the government was going to be LGBTQ folks. And so we decided to create a very robust June Pride program here at the cathedral. And always as part of that programming, we've done something that was theological or biblical. So this year, I thought, I've heard a number of Dan's reels on LGBTQ issues, and I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could do just a webinar with Dr. McClellan? And I thought, but of course, he'll never want to talk to me, and thought, but I'll try anyway. So I found, of all things, a postal address, no email, a postal address, and I sent him a paper letter thinking, well, I may as well just throw this in the trash, but you know what, I'll do it. And within a few days, he emailed me and said, I do want to do this. I do want to talk to you. And then said, why don't we do it in person? Which, again, I couldn't believe it. But so at the time, Dan's book was not published yet. So I ordered it, as many of you did. And now, as you know, it's hit the bestseller list, and it's become a sort of phenomenon. How often does a book with a religious theme end up on the bestseller list? So that tells you something. So this event then tonight is a part of our Jude Pride programming, but it's also a launch for this book. So Dan, we're really, really happy that you're here.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. I was surprised by your letter, mainly because it arrived in the mail, and I had to open it up and read it. But I'm obviously very concerned about the way people are leveraging the Bible to hurt other people. So this is something that's very important to me, and I do what I can to try to honor those kinds of requests. But as I mentioned to you, I was already going to be on the East Coast, so yep. I thought it would be more fun, I think, to be here in person. So,
well, it's more fun for these folks for sure, so yeah. It's more fun for me, so thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you, everybody, for being here. I appreciate it very much.
So I've read the book. I really have.
Thank you.
And it struck me as I read the book that the book feels like you. In a way, it's almost like it's got your humor, it's got your snark. It also, each chapter almost feels like the transcription of one of your reels. It's a little nice, tight little pieces. So maybe we could just think of the book and your TikTok real ministry, your work, and talk about why do you do this? What compels you to do all of this?
Well, it's kind of, there are a few different motivations that have kind of accumulated over the years, but initially this is a product of, well, to begin, I've been arguing with people about religion on the internet for 25 years and when I made the decision about almost 25 years ago to pursue biblical studies as a career, to go get a series of degrees in it because I wanted to spend my life studying the Bible. As I got into that work, into my undergraduate and then graduate degrees, I became more and more aware of how much of a gulf there is that separates the way experts think and talk about the Bible and the way people on the streets and in the pews think and talk about the Bible. And this is a conversation I've had countless times with peers in my cohort in my undergraduate and graduate programs, where we're picking up skills, we're picking up resources, knowledge, we're part of this discourse ecosystem that is overwhelmingly confined to the ivory tower. And every student that I ever talked to about this was concerned with how to democratize access to that kind of information. It's a perennial problem, but there's not a really handy solution. And 20 years ago, it was message boards and blogs that I was on with friends, and we would try to correct this misinformation, but people have to come to you in order to find that. And so there's just not an enormous audience. There's not a lot of reach for that kind of work. And I even had other colleagues, friends of mine, who are archaeologists, who are philologists, who are other kinds of scholars related to the Bible and religion, and we put together a little email list and Facebook group that was dedicated to making each other aware of spurious claims, fake artifacts that were being discovered and publicized and all this kind of stuff, so that we could mobilize and respond to that kind of thing. So, but again, that wasn't getting much reach. And it was during the pandemic that I started to see people sharing TikTok videos on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And I thought that TikTok was just for, my shoes are a mess. I thought TikTok was just for Korean teenagers to disrupt Republican presidential campaigns. And I was happy to let them have it. But I saw videos commenting on the Bible, and I thought, who's in charge over there? I need to go see. I need to talk to the manager. So I started lurking on TikTok, if the kids even call it that anymore. I don't know. They move so quick these days. They do? Awesome. Thank you for somebody finally verifying that for me. But I started lurking, and I found that there were a bunch of communities that were talking about the Bible. There were atheists and deconstructionists. There were conspiracy theorists. There were apologists and everything in between. And they all had their takes, but I didn't really see a credentialed expert. I didn't see somebody calling balls and strikes. And that's kind of always how I wanted to represent my scholarship and my expertise on social media. And I thought, okay, well, I might as well give it a try here as well. And the first video I ever made, it was very uncomfortable for me to point a camera at myself and hit record. People ask me all the time why my account has been so successful. And I say, the only thing I know, it's not this. So whatever it is, it's not that. But the first video I ever made was responding to a video that was promoting these fake artifacts called the Jordan-led codices, which was one of the very first things that my friends and I responded to back in 2011 when a con artist released a press release talking about these things as first century Christian texts. And so I was like, well, if I'm going to pull the trigger, it's going to be now. And to my surprise, the algorithm, for all that is good and bad about it, found all kinds of people who are interested in this. And so this was a platform that, for whatever reason, was actually finding an awful lot of people who were interested in this kind of stuff. And so unlike my work on Facebook and Twitter and message boards and blogs and things like that, this was actually reaching out to people where they were, and I got a very favorable response, which was phenomenal and very exciting. And then after my channel started growing, that's when I started accumulating new reasons for doing this, because I found folks across all of those communities who were interested in this and whose it sounds kind of like a humble brag, but it's something that is always very meaningful to me when people tell me this, that I've helped them heal from trauma, or I've helped them fix relationships with parents or siblings or children or friends, and I've helped them to come to appreciate the Bible, even if they're no longer religious. Some people say, you helped me regain my faith. Other people said, you helped me be comfortable with leaving my faith. And so across the spectrum of belief and non-belief, I have heard from a lot of folks who've said that my making that scholarship more accessible to them has made a big difference, which has meant the world to me. I didn't set out with the idea of, I'm going to change a bunch of people's lives, but I've heard from an awful lot of people who have said that to me, which means I can't stop doing it, because now it's that much more important to me. And also there's, with a platform like this, I run across an awful lot of people who are doing an awful lot of significant harm to vulnerable communities, and particularly LGBTQIA plus individuals and groups. And that's also something that I feel very strongly about, that is something I have to wield whatever access to power and resources I have against folks who are wielding the Bible against those groups. So that has also become a motivation and a reason for doing what I'm doing. And if you can't tell yet, I ramble, so I apologize. If it's just throw something at me if it gets a little boring. So
Speaking of throwing something at you, just so you know, when all of you came in, on your seats there was a pen and a piece of paper. You can, if you'd like to address any questions to Dan, just write them down, hold it over your head, and someone will come and collect those from you, and then my colleague, Canon Alyssa Newton, will then ask us the questions. Those of you who are with us online, you can also type questions. There's an email address for you to send questions to. So we'll do that during the hour. So just as you, don't wait till the end. If you come up with something, just let Canon Newton know now. So, but for now I am asking the question. So Dan, you said that what you became aware of was how the kind of work you were doing in academia was, the way you were approaching the biblical text was very different from how people in the pews, you said, people in the pews were approaching the text. How were people approaching the text? What was going on that you saw as being problematic or challenging? Or
So I think that to preface this a little bit, I have to talk a little bit about my own faith. Don't get too excited. I'm not going to get deep into it. But what I joined the LDS Church when I was 20 years old, and I was raised, I would say, a moderately intelligent 20-year-old. I was a critical thinker, and I brought into my membership in the LDS Church a lot of ideas about how the world worked and about how things like sacred texts worked. And it was not the way that most people raise their children within those faiths to think about how the world works, how sacred texts work. And for some reason, I slipped through the cracks and nobody ever disabused me of any of that. They just let me approach the text the way I wanted to. And the Latter-day Saint tradition is rather unique in that it doesn't really have a concept of, or a dogma about things like inerrancy. There's kind of a de facto sense of it, but no formal doctrine of inerrancy. And so I spent my time in the LDS Church thinking of the Bible, the LDS scriptures, the same way I had learned to think about things like the Quran and the Bhagavad Gita and things like that. These were the products of human industry. And then I got into school and scholars talked about them the same way. And I never had to be disabused of much in my schooling. But then I went to, my first graduate degree was at Oxford. My second was at Trinity Western University in Langley, British Columbia, which is an evangelical university. And I got to know a lot of more mainstream Christian approaches to the Bible. And that's where I was having a lot of these conversations with people who presupposed the dogmas of univocality and inspiration and inerrancy and all these things. And that was an alien way of thinking about the Bible to me. But I became more and more aware of the fact that that's actually how the overwhelming majority of Bible believers thought about the Bible. And so that was where it started, where I thought, well, you can't recognize that one author doesn't necessarily agree on everything that another author has to say. And so it was, that was where I kind of recognized that there was a bit of a disparity, a bit of a gulf there. And the more I was discussing religion and the Bible online, the more I became aware of the fact that those dogmas were predominant within pretty much every other faith tradition.
Could you say something about, could you unpack what those words mean for people who don't necessarily know what univocality means or inerrancy means?
So yeah, univocality is one that, on the Dan McClellan bingo card, that's the center one. But that's just a fancy word that means one voice. And the idea is that the entire Bible speaks from one single unified and consistent perspective and with one single unified and consistent voice. And the implication is that it never disagrees with itself. It never contradicts itself. All of the texts are pointing in the same direction and speaking with the same voice, which also has other implications. It means that if you think of all the texts of the Bible as a bunch of Lego pieces, Lego bricks, excuse me, sorry. In my book, I said Lego blocks, and I've had some people write to me about that, but initially it was just going to be Legos, but I found out on social media that I was going to wake up with a horse's head in my bed if I wrote that. So, but if you think of the Bible as a bunch of Lego bricks, ultimately what it means is you can build whatever you want, and the idea is, oh, that's what was intended, because it all agrees. It's all pointed in the same direction. It all has the same ultimate goal. There can never be two pieces that were not meant to be together. But what that does is that then endows your creation, whatever it may be, with all the things with which you endow God. The inspiration, the inerrancy, the authority, all of that kind of stuff. So inspiration is another dogma, that is the idea that the Bible was articulated under divine inspiration, the guidance of the Spirit. There are a lot of different levels of inspiration and inerrancy, but ultimately the idea is that authors wrote under divine inspiration, which meant it's God's words, not necessarily the author's own words. And then inerrancy is the idea that it has no errors in it, whether there's a kind of I don't know what the spectrum is called, but there's a soft inerrancy that is kind of like, it's only in matters pertaining to faith. Mm-hmm. When it comes to, whether or not axe heads float, or whether or not the sun stands still in the sky, maybe there can be errors there, but and then the other side would be, no, there are no errors of any kind whatsoever anywhere in the text, at least in the original autographs. And so these are all inerrancy, inspiration, univocality. These are all what I call dogmas, because they're not conclusions that one arrives at through a careful and critical interrogation of the evidence. They're things you start with, and they can't be questioned. They're not going away. They're things that you accept because you're required to accept them. And so that's why my motto, my aspirational motto, data over dogma, is really saying, hey, let's consider these dogmas as dogmas, and let's see where the data take us apart from the dogmas. And it takes you to angering an awful lot of people all around the world, because those dogmas are really identity markers that allow different intersections of social identities to curate their boundaries, because they're ways to find out who's in and who's out. Mm-hmm. It's kind of a shibboleth. Are you going to, do you say the creed, the right creed? Do you say it the right way? Do you pronounce the words the right way? You see on Twitter all the time, people will say, I believe the Bible has no contradictions. Do you? Mm. And this is a way to signal to others, I'm willing to toe the line. I'm willing to put on display my fidelity to the group's standards and mores, and now I'm calling on you to do the same in order to signal to me that you are also willing to toe the line. It's a way to police boundaries and engage in identity politics. And there are an awful lot of identity markers that are used these days, and increasingly opposition to the rights of LGBTQIA individuals and communities is a central identity marker for a lot of Christians these days.
Yeah, and maybe we could then just segue into that topic.
Okay.
So we all, have heard our whole lives people use what some people call the clobber verses to attack queer people, and especially queer people's romantic and erotic both urges and behaviors. And they'll say, but look, it says this. The text says this. How do you? And we Anglicans know very well that this is something that is almost tore the Episcopal Church in the United States apart, and now really is tearing the whole Anglican communion of churches apart, because we're all independent national churches, and it's a huge issue for us. I wonder if you could, not in America so much, but in the other churches, I wonder if you could just, in any way you find helpful, talk about the Bible's approach to the whole queer phenomenon.
It's a complex topic, and what I usually start off with is pointing out that the Bible approaches questions of sexual ethics in a very different way, because they thought about sex in a very different way anciently. Sex was not an activity that two equal agents mutually engaged in. It was something that an active sexual agent did to a passive sexual object. It was a one-way act. And in that one-way act, the agency and the consent of the passive sexual object wasn't really relevant. So it was really something that one individual did to another. And the roles were kind of socially conventionalized. You had a hierarchy of domination, and certain individuals, based on how they looked, what their body looked like, and things like that, occupied different roles. And the only time the Hebrew Bible ever addresses really the propriety of same-sex intercourse is in Leviticus 18:22 and Leviticus 20:13. And this is a relatively late literary layer. This is known as the Holiness Code. This is a subset of the priestly layer of the Pentateuch. So this is a post-exilic text that is very concerned for purity. They're coming back from exile. You have concerns for ethnic purity. You have concerns for this covenantal relationship with God that you want to ensure results in your protection, your ability to remain in the land, and which is why in Leviticus 18 and in Leviticus 20, you have all these sexual proscriptions, things you're not supposed to do, and both chapters frame this as this is what you have to do so that you are not vomited out of the land. And they use that language because the idea seems to be that these sexual indiscretions, whether it is incest or same-sex intercourse or intercourse with other inappropriate sexual partners, it was conceptualized as kind of generating a kind of metaphysical contamination that got out onto the land, and the land could only tolerate so much of it before it would vomit out the inhabitants. And the texts say that that's what happened to the nations that lived there before. And so Israel is supposed to maintain this degree of purity so that they're not vomited out. And the only way to purge that contamination is in Leviticus 18, it says, anybody who does these things will be cut off. And what's interesting about all of the proscriptions in there is that all of them only address the sexual agent. They never address the other partner in the act. Leviticus 20 expands on things, and instead of one general punishment, saying anybody who does these things will be cut off, it actually assigns a different punishment for each one of the different acts, but all of the punishments apply to both partners in the act. And I think the idea there was probably that in order to purge this contamination, both parties have to be punished, even though the submissive partner's agency wasn't really a concern. And so this even holds for where it prohibits intercourse with an animal. Even the animal is killed in that instance, and their agency, their consent is obviously not relevant at all to this standard. So it's an entirely different sexual ethic. They were thinking about human sexuality in entirely different ways. The reasons for these proscriptions are entirely different from how we think about these things today. And so a lot of people think that I argue the Hebrew Bible has nothing to say about same-sex intercourse. It does. It is condemnatory of it, but it's also an entirely different category than the way we think about it today. And it's also not relevant to anybody who's not either part of the house of Israel or living in the land of Israel. Leviticus is entirely about the land of Israel, and it's entirely about the house of Israel. I think when you take a good hard look at all of the details of these passages, and specifically in the Hebrew Bible, what we see is something that is entirely obsolete and outdated and has no relevance whatsoever to our sexual ethic today. And so, at least when it comes to the passages in the Hebrew Bible, I don't think there is a plausible way to transfer those proscriptions, those condemnations wholesale to today without doing significant violence to their situatedness, their context, and what the authors of those texts were actually getting at. So those passages in the Hebrew Bible, I think, are totally irrelevant to the way we structure our sexual ethic today.
Well, then how about something rather than something proscriptive? How about something that is seemingly prescriptive?
Okay.
And that's why don't we talk about the creation narratives in Genesis? And there would be people who would claim, the old God created Adam and Eve and not Adam and Steve trope, that there is a prescription that people are to use their sexuality for procreation, and that anything else, the implication that anything else is somehow an aberration.
Yeah, that's an interesting claim, because a lot of people understand the prohibition on male same-sex intercourse that we find in Leviticus 18 and 20 to be about wasting seed. This can't result in procreation. If that were true, we would expect also to find a prohibition on self-pleasure, which is entirely absent from the Bible. There's not a breath of any concern whatsoever for that anywhere in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament. And no, Onan is not an exception. Onan was about levirate marriage and Onan's refusal to honor the duties of levirate marriage. So I don't think that interpretation of the motivations for what we find there is legitimate. Now, certainly when we get to Genesis 2:24 and things like that, procreation is important to the survival of this people. And Genesis 2:24 also gets trotted out an awful lot, and particularly when Jesus is quoting it in Matthew 19. So we see that a lot when you say Jesus never says anything about homosexuality, and people will say, yes, he did. He quoted Genesis 2:24. Obviously, that means marriage is between one man and one woman. But Genesis 2:24 is not a prescriptive text either. Genesis 2:24 is a descriptive etiology for pair bonding and for independent kinship units. The idea is woman was taken from man, and when man grows up, matures, he leaves his father and his mother and cleaves unto his wife. They become one flesh. It's basically the idea is returning to that initial state. But this is an etiology. It's not a prescription of marriage between one man and one woman. Primarily, one of the main reasons we know this is because this was written in a period when polygamy was normative. It wasn't most marriages. It was really only the men who could afford multiple households, but it was normative. And so it's certainly not prohibiting polygamy. It's certainly not prescribing monogamy. And so I don't see a way to interpret it as otherwise prescriptive regarding same-sex marriage today. But at the same time, again, this is an entirely different understanding of human sexuality, and I'm sure that we don't want to import all of the sexual ethic of the book of Genesis into today. We always have to negotiate with what we're bringing into the modern world, whether people want to admit it or not. There's always a negotiation taking place. And so ultimately it's up to us to determine what we're going to keep, what we're going to do away with as part of that negotiation.
You talk about negotiation a lot. Could you give us an example of how we have to negotiate with the text? We have to negotiate with the text. That has nothing to do with sex or homosex?
Something I brought up recently was the question of dietary restrictions. This is a good example. In the New Testament, if you ask somebody today, is it a sin to eat blood sausage? Is it a sin to eat something that somebody else sacrificed to an idol? Well, it depends on how you negotiate with the text. Because when we look in Acts 15, we have the results of the Jerusalem Council is a set of rules where they basically say, okay, Gentile converts to Christ following are not required to keep the law of Moses, but we're going to have these 4 things you are required to keep. Abstain from sexual immorality. Sorry, I had to bring it up, but sexual immorality. Abstain from things sacrificed to idols, from things strangled, and from blood. And then the text says, and we gave a copy to Paul, and Paul took it to all the different churches around the world. But then when you look in Romans, Paul is like, nah, there's no dietary restrictions. An idol is nothing in the world. It doesn't matter. Eating something sacrificed to an idol doesn't mean anything. It's only a problem if you do it in the presence of a weaker Christian who might not know what you know and might be scandalized by seeing you eat something that they think you're not allowed to eat. And so Paul disagrees with Acts 15. And so what is the Christian standard today? Well, you have to figure out, well, which text am I going to give priority to? Mm-hmm. And which text am I going to then reinterpret and force to agree with the text to which I've given priority? That's a process of negotiation. And the majority of Christians today have sided with Paul and said no dietary restrictions.
And as you know, I mean, for a very long time, the world headquarters of Jehovah's Witnesses was just right across the Brooklyn Bridge, and so there's a very large presence of Jehovah's Witnesses here who side with the Jerusalem Council.
Yes, that's an example of one of the minority of groups that their negotiation went the other direction.
Yeah. Well, you did mention sexual immorality, so there we are. So we do have to talk about the New Testament text. Mm-hmm. So do you want to talk about the Pauline texts that are used to clobber gay people?
I think people who want to appeal to Paul's sexual ethic probably don't have a good understanding of Paul's sexual ethic, because he would have preferred that everybody remain celibate. I think of Paul as the Ned Flanders, good for keeping down the urges, because he does in Romans 1, verses 26 and 27, I think, in my opinion, there are some scholars who disagree, but does seem to address female same-sex intercourse and male same-sex intercourse. And this is an interesting thing about the Hebrew Bible. The only passage that in any way addresses female same-sex intercourse is Romans 1:26. It's nowhere addressed at all in the Hebrew Bible, which is why in many Jewish streams of tradition, lesbianism isn't really considered a problem. But Paul does seem to address it in this kind of rhetorical snare that he has set up for his Jewish listeners, where he condemns the Gentiles, and then they're thinking, yeah, get him, Paul, and then he kind of turns it around on him and says, but because they're worthy of death, but you are also guilty of violating the law. But he paints this picture of the Gentiles being without excuse because of a kind of natural theology. Paul's idea is that anybody who observes nature can arrive at an accurate understanding of God's nature and how God expects to be worshipped. And the Greeks obviously observed nature, yet they worship the created rather than the creator. And so Paul says they are without excuse, they stand under condemnation, and as punishment, God has given them over to these unnatural desires, which suggests, in my opinion, the idea that God has removed kind of the ceiling on sexual desires. Paul seems to think that normally God keeps sexual desire under a limit, but for the Greeks, as punishment, he's removed that limit and allowed it to just run wild. And so in Paul's argument, same-sex intercourse is only something that happens to people who are under God's condemnation. In other words, it's only the Gentiles, the righteous followers of Jesus, or the righteous Jewish folks, don't have that issue, which is a falsehood. That's obviously not the case, even though even today people try to suggest that people who are adequately faithful won't have to deal with that kind of stuff. And so I think Paul is basing his condemnation of same-sex intercourse on an inadequate understanding of human sexuality. He talks about men giving up the natural utility of their women, but he also says nature. Doesn't nature also testify that it is shameful for a man to have long hair? So his understanding of how nature works is problematic as well. But he also goes on to talk about how he's reflecting a very kind of Platonic / Stoic concept of sex, where sexual desire is one of the baser urges of the flesh that we just need to overcome entirely. It doesn't really have any utility for us. Paul doesn't care about procreation at all. Jesus is coming back too soon for anybody to get pregnant anyway. So for Paul, procreation isn't even on the table. Yeah. Paul would like everybody to be celibate unless you can't hack celibacy. He says it's better to marry than to burn, and the idea is to burn with sexual desire. And so in order that people's sexual desire doesn't get so pent up that it results in sexual immorality, Paul says you can have that escape valve. Mm-hmm. You can get married, so you can go have your occasional prophylactic passionless sex. As he talks in 1 Thessalonians 4 about how you're supposed to possess your vessel, that being your wife, in holiness and honor, not with the passion of desire like the Gentiles who do not know God, which suggests to me a little more Puritan, a little more Victorian an approach to sex than I think most Christians today would be comfortable with. But we reject that feature of Paul's sexual ethic. There are Catholics, certainly, who suggest that there's a space for that, but it's certainly not something that everybody is exhorted to strive for. Mm-hmm. We reject that feature of Paul's sexual ethic. His theory of human sexuality is entirely wrong. There are so many features of Paul's just general ethic that we reject. Why are we holding on to this outdated, this scientifically inaccurate concept of where same-sex behaviors, attraction and intercourse come from? Why are we holding on to this? It's because it has become a convenient identity marker. It's become a way to establish and police boundaries. It's become a way to tell who is in and who is out, who's one of us and who's one of them. And that utility is really the primary reason that we still hold on to this after having rejected so many other things. Slavery, for instance, something that we just got together and said, you know what, the Bible's wrong on that. We're overruling the Bible. We're not doing that anymore. We've already been through that renegotiation. But because this is such a handy identity marker, so many people are fighting tooth and nail to hold on to it.
We've been talking about 40 minutes, and
I've been rambling.
No,
lot, yeah.
It's just gems of wisdom. But I'm wondering if there are any. I've seen people turn in questions, and I wonder if. Ken and Newton, do you want to?
There are so many questions. I've been sorting them into categories. I know exactly what 2 questions will end with. But in the meantime,
Superman is
I'm very excited.
obviously.
I'm very excited. There is a pop culture reference in one of them that
Awesome.
I can't wait to see play out.
I look forward to all of you giggling to yourselves in private when you get all the pop culture references in the book, if you haven't already. And if you want to hear me say the F word, get the audio book. So, just
Really?
a little teaser there.
Wow. I
know how much you like to cuss.
I thought you footnoted all of the cultural references.
A lot of them.
Apologies to this one and apologies to that one.
Not remotely all of them, but yeah, where the section titles are song lyrics or movie quotes or things like that, yeah.
So, I have them in some categories.
Okay.
Would you like to answer a question about your, that's related to your social media experience? A question that's more like grounded in your biblical scholarship, or a question that kind of connects biblical scholarship with present-day religious questions?
Dealer's choice.
Oh, for heaven's sake. Okay. All right. How about this one? This is interesting. There's a couple that are kind of related here.
Okay.
But one is, have you had any favorable discourse with those in the posts you've challenged in your reels?
It's rare, but I have. There are some folks who have, like, I'm talking 0.5% of the time that I criticize someone, they will come back and say, you're right, I was wrong, I appreciate the correction. There's one example I can think of, and I'll tell you why it was a very unexpected example, but he came back and deleted his video posted my video in its place, and then posted another video telling everybody to ignore his old video and check out my video. And he's a flat earther.
Wow.
And he did not stop being a flat earther, but he did take full accountability for the specific video that I was critiquing related to the Bible. So that was a surprise. But there have been some examples of that, and even some examples of folks who are now I would call them friends. So yeah, it is rare, but it does happen.
So this is, I think, a related question. Given your experience with the wide audience of social media, what do you see as the most viable approach for encouraging an outlook of tolerance towards so-called minorities among those who adhere to a fundamentalist or conservative Christian biblical interpretation?
That's a difficult question, because I think there's an awful lot of research out there that would suggest that all the data in the world can't really crack the nut of fundamentalist thinking, because what an individual has to do first is let down their guard and think critically. And if you're throwing data at them, that almost never does the job, which is one of the reasons that I think my primary target audience does not have those folks near the top of the list. I think a lot of research suggests that the two things that are most conducive to a fundamentalist thinker letting down their guard would be, one, intense personal experiences, and two, close personal relationships. It's not that those things are silver bullets, but the odds of getting someone to lower their guard and begin to think critically about these things, at which point the evidence actually does become useful, those are the two things that increase the odds of that happening. And so I hear that question a lot from folks who come to me and say, I have family, I have friends, I have this, that, and the other. I want to get through to them. What do I have to do? It's like there's not a foolproof way to do that. And it is a tall order, too, because what we're asking people to do, fundamentalist thinkers to do, is to say, and me, for instance, if they just come across a video of mine, they're basically just cruising the internet to blow off steam or whatever at the end of a day. And here I come to say, you should abandon your entire worldview. And you should risk your family relationships. You should risk your job. You should risk your relationships with coworkers. Like, it's a tall order to say, hey, challenge your entire worldview. And particularly if it's just something that somebody is scrolling through and happens across. So I think it's not difficult to understand why that is a very, very difficult thing to do. But close personal relationships, intense personal experiences have a better chance of doing that. So, and there's not a good way to intentionally go about trying to catalyze intense personal experiences. So I think it's something you just have to take advantage of the opportunities when they present themselves.
Thank you.
I'm a
This question
man,
has something to do with, I think, one of those dogmas that we have heard about. The question is, growing up, I was taught that each covenant God made established new rules. Rainbow, sorry, I won't kill everyone again. Exodus, here's the law. Jesus, the golden rule. What I want to understand is, do new covenants not supersede the last one? Would a New Testament covenant not erase old?
That's certainly one of the ways that people have thought about it. That's something called dispensationalism, the idea that God dispenses new covenants, new ways to frame relationships, new ways to understand God's nature and relationship with humanity. And certainly there are folks who interpret it that way, but there are also others who think if God is unchanging, if God's will is unchanging, then it should be cumulative rather than iterative, rather than replacing other things. And that comes with its own challenges, because obviously things have changed quite a bit, even from one part of the Hebrew Bible to another part of the Hebrew Bible, and that's where you get accommodationism. Oh, it's God is accommodating everything to the capacities of the audience. And so it seems like it is just a fallible human industry doing all this, and that's just God making it seem like that to fool you. So there are, that's certainly a popular way to approach things, but it is not without its hermeneutic challenges, and I think it is, but it's also a bit more of an honest way to approach things, to recognize that things seem to have replaced other things. Some things seem to have become outmoded and been jettisoned, while other things seem to have, and even since the Bible was completed, that seems to have happened. This is something that I briefly mentioned slavery. That was something that a lot of people have, it took a couple of centuries for people to come up with an argument for why the Bible is against slavery that enough people could get behind, that it reached a critical mass and Christians just pivoted to saying, no, we're against slavery now. They had to come up with all kinds of different hermeneutic sleights of hand and techniques to make it seem like the God of the Bible is opposed to slavery. And now everybody's happy with what they came up with, and so it's an example of, it turns out we replaced that thing with this more enlightened thing. The problem with the now we're more enlightened is, who's next? What are we doing now that God is like, not yet my ideal, this is still just a temporary thing just because you morons can't get it right? What about the way we live now is that way? You can't say, within that rationalization of dispensationalism, you can't really say, no, we're at the end. We're perfect now. Everybody thought that. Every single generation said, oh, this is the end. We got it right now. And so, there we go, rambling again. Yeah, it's deeply problematic.
Well, this should be an easy question for you then. What are your thoughts on whether Jesus would have been considered progressive or conservative in his time?
Jesus would have been considered radical in his time. Now, radical in the 1st century CE in Judea is not radical in the 21st century in the United States or in many other places, but certainly what Jesus was advocating for was pushing the boundaries of progressivism, and depending on how you reconstruct the historical Jesus, because if you look in Matthew, you have someone who is probably more of a Judaizer, probably somebody who said, no, the entire law of Moses is still in effect. In fact, we're going to escalate things, and your righteousness must exceed the righteousness of the Pharisees. But you also have this idea that in Matthew 19, that the most pious people are going to make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven, which is more of an ascetic, celibate ideal, which would have been considered phenomenally radical for the Jewish folks of that time and day. I think the historical Jesus probably wouldn't have thought much about same-sex marriage, and so probably would have just defaulted to whatever the conventional wisdom was at the time without thinking too hard about it. But if we, and the counterfactual history is such a complex rabbit hole to dive down, but if we brought Jesus to today and educated him on the history since the 1st century CE and educated him on all the social movements and all that kind of stuff, what would his position be today? That's, you can't really say for sure, but I think it would probably be a more radical one than a lot of folks think.
This is I think, a kind of pride-related question. Despite the fact that they were probably entirely mythological figures, what is the real import of the description of David and Jonathan's relationship?
I don't know is the answer. I think there's a plausible argument to make that at the time, like, look, we already know from the story of David that the king got to not only commit adultery, but commit murder and basically got away with it. Like, if the law of Moses were actually in circulation at that time period, he should have been killed. He wasn't. It's good to be the king. The king can do what he wants to do. If the king wanted to have a sexual relationship with another man, there was no one around who could tell him, hey, you're not supposed to do that. He does what he wants. So it's certainly plausible that could have been a sexual relationship, and some of the language certainly sounds like that. At the same time, I think there's an equally plausible case to make that this is just using that kind of language to describe more of a friendship that was being used to paint Saul as the weak leader and David as the one who was going to take over everything. And one of the manifestations of that was, look, even Saul's own son and heir is fawning after David and is submissive to him. I tend to think that a sexual relationship would have been even more of a polemic against Saul in that time period, not so much as a way to lionize David or Jonathan, more as a way to say, man, this is really pathetic. Even your own son is now the submissive partner in a sexual relationship with your challenger. So I can see the way that rhetoric could work out. We'll never know for sure. I think we'll just continue to argue about what makes more sense, and I think they kind of make equal sense to me.
Awesome. Okay, here's a translation question. In John 1, logos in English is translated as word, and as in the beginning was the word, yet in Spanish, the line is rendered with verbo, or verb, instead of word. Which of these would be closer to the Greek, verb or word? And how much do you think this translation choice of word has affected Western English understanding of that passage versus Spanish understanding of the same passage?
I recall when I lived in Uruguay a song, an evangelical song that said, Jesus es verbo no sustantivo, which means Jesus is a verb, not a noun. And I think that probably plays into that. The Greek word logos is not very easily translated because it could mean so many different things. It could mean thing, it could mean issue, it could mean event, it could mean word, it could mean word in a lot of different senses. But the idea is basically a reflection of Middle Platonic ideas about divine mediation, that it was more about God's rationality. The logos was God's rationality. You had the idea of God's innate rationality. This is God's ability to think and reason. And then you have the logos as God's expressed rationality. This is the actual rationality physically manifested in speech. And because in this Middle Platonic system, the divine and the world of the flesh are incommensurate categories, the divine cannot engage with, become entangled with, enter into the world of the flesh. The logos is the means of bridging that gap between the truly divine and the fleshly world. And you have a lot of different philosophers who are outside of Christianity and Judaism who talk about that. And so I think it's beyond both of those ideas. But I think the question of, I think in English, when we translate logos as word, that resonates with the whole Word of God in the sense of the Scriptures thing. So I think it lends itself to the understanding of the Word of God as, in some sense, somehow entangled with Jesus's identity. So I think that is an artifact of the English translation. I don't know how. It's been a long time since I've engaged with the discourse on the Bible in Spanish, but I imagine that the idea is that it has influenced the idea of faith in Jesus as a faith that is expressed in doing rather than in just saying. So probably in a bit more living your faith rather than just expressing your faith. But I don't, because I know South America has, well, no, actually I don't know. 25 years ago I knew what how many Spanish speakers were were Catholic versus non-Catholic, but I have no idea what that would be these days. I'm sure it's changed significantly. So I would have to say pass on the question of how it relates to the Spanish discourse.
I can tell that Canon Newton is ready to go again, but we've been at this now for an hour, which is
Are you ready for the last two?
I wanted to ask all right. I had a question, but
Oh, go for it.
no.
You're in
because
charge.
I know, but because I'm just aware of two things. One, that, we said an hour, and so we should keep to an hour. Also, Dan's not leaving, so Dan is, for those of you who have books, Dan is happy to.
We did start about 10 minutes after, though.
Yep, and we'll finish 10 minutes after. And I know that many of you have books you'd like Dan to sign, and he's going to do that. And Dan will hang around and talk to you, so the conversation can continue. But I just want to respect people's time. And so the question that I wanted to ask you is it's not textual, because you always tell us that you're a scholar of religion and the Bible. And being a scholar of religion, you have to know something about the social sciences. And so here's my question for you, because I want to wrap up our time by zeroing in on the LGBTQ question. So as I said at the beginning, as you've said, LGBTQ people are very much in the crosshairs right now, in ways that we, I think, imagined theoretically, but we couldn't quite imagine it would really happen. But it actually is happening. My partner said to me when the current regime was coming to power that he hoped that we would end up in the same concentration camp. And in a way it was gallows humor, because I'm not so sure that that's so far from the truth. But my question for you is, knowing what you know about religion, where do you see all of this going, given the way religions work? Given the way that culture works around and with religion, what is going to happen to gay people, LGBTQ people, but also to this relentless use of religion to attack us?
I think there's probably. I will say I can't imagine it will do anything other than get a lot worse before it gets better. But I think there's going to be a point at which it peaks. I think it's going to result in some pretty significant changes, I think very similar to what happened with slavery. There were people who were not willing to give up their position on that without fighting for it, and it resulted, at least in the United States. Some other places had a much easier time accepting this pivot away from the morality of slavery. It was in the post for a long time, but they were able to make that shift relatively peacefully in the United States because we are such an impetuous nation and always have been. I think there are an awful lot of people very similar to slavery who are not going to give up without a fight, and I imagine that it will come down to some kind of violence, unfortunately, because as the conservative end of that digs their heels in deeper, they have to continue to escalate the credibility enhancing display, because again, this is all an identity marker, and identity markers usually escalate as you have to one up other folks, which we saw this with the abortion debate. It starts off with, okay, we're not going to do an abortion except in the case of incest, rape, or the threats to the life of the mother. And then you get some doofus who goes out on a stage and goes, no, not even any exceptions. That's a way to one up, to show I feel even stronger than you about this. And we have the same kind of stuff going on with the question of LGBTQIA plus rights in the States. And so, unfortunately, I think people are going to dig their heels in even harder. And if the government is unable to actually legislate on this in a way that puts the matter to bed, I think at some point it's going to result in some kind of violence, and that terrifies me. And I think there are a handful of issues like that taking place right now. I think immigration is another one where Lives are going to be lost before the people have those intense personal experiences or close personal relationships that allow them to look past their identity politics and overcome the bigotry of homophobia and xenophobia and all of those things. I have other friends who suggest that this is a marketplace of ideas. Religion is a marketplace of ideas, and their theory is that it's going to peter out as things become less and less entangled with religion and more entangled with nationalism, that religion is just going to kind of lose its interest in this. So I have a friend named David Congdon who wrote a book called Who Gets to Be a Christian, and talks about this, about how he thinks that conservative evangelicalism is going to peter out and no longer have a place at the table in the U.S. But I think it's, again, another situation where it could result in violence. It could result in something very acute happening before people grow the hell up and see what the purpose of all of this is and what the harm of all of it is.
So as all of this plays out, so those of us who are on the side of the angel, so what do we do?
That's a difficult question. I don't know. I think keep pushing people that you know to take this seriously, to recognize the kind of harm that this causes, to consider the people whose lives are affected by this. I think a very effective thing that someone did in teaching a Sunday school class one time was to point out, and I don't remember the words exactly, but the idea was basically to point out that, look, the people you're talking about, when they talk about specific people and specific examples of what they consider to be manifestations of the problem with LGBTQIA identities, they're not going to hear you, but somebody in your household might. Mm-hmm. Somebody who might grow to realize that you don't think they deserve to live, that you don't think their identity is valid, that you think they're a mistake. There are a lot of households with children in them who have not come out to family members who may say horrific things about them. So I think making people aware of how close that reality is to everybody. Everybody knows somebody who is a member of one of those identities, whether they know it or not. And if someone has not told you, it might be because they know they're not safe around you, if you know. So I don't know. I'm going to continue to try to do what I think I do best, and try to raise the call to get over this, share the data on this, and to the degree that gives people the resources to be able to engage the discussion. If I can do that, then hopefully I'm doing my part. But yeah, unfortunately, I'm of little use beyond that. But there are an awful lot of people out there who are deeper in the trenches than I am, who have an awful lot more to say about that than me, and I wish they were here now to take the mic from me.
Well, we really are glad you all came tonight. Throughout.
We do have two really important questions that need to get asked.
All right.
They're really important. They're really important.
Reverend Madam, go ahead.
There are two questions that were written, I think, by 3 people. We're not really saying names out.
I think I know their names.
But one of them was signed your favorite daughter. And the question is chocolate or vanilla.
Chocolate.
And then the other one, which is very politely phrased, says, "Can you talk in a Kermit the Frog voice, please?"
So a while ago, there's this great talk show called Graham Norton.
Yeah,
If you
sure.
have not watched Graham Norton, you have to watch Graham Norton. I think he does it better than anyone else today. But he had Seth MacFarlane on there. And Seth MacFarlane, I don't know the context, but he did Liam Neeson's speech from Taken as Kermit the Frog. And it's so funny. And one day I just thought I would try it out in front of my girls, and they loved it. So I started doing the Kermit the Frog thing. What was the request? Just to say anything as Kermit the Frog?
Can you talk in a Kermit the Frog voice, please?
I don't even remember all of the Neeson monologue, though. It was like, I don't have any money. But what I do have is a set of skills. Skills that make me a nightmare to people like you. Oh, gosh. And, and the fit for this video, I guess, has been the James Gunn Superman. And I wish I could sing, because then I would just sing Rainbow Connection, and that would be a perfect way to tie all this together. But I am awful at singing, so I'm going to spare you that embarrassment. So.
All that erudition, you clap for the Kermit voice. So Alyssa, are you finished?
Yes.
All right. So anyway, can I talk again? Oh, gosh. Thank you. So there's a lot that happens here all the time. This is a very dynamic place, but there'll be a lot happening during June. So I would invite all of you to come back. We have musical things and religious things and family party picnic things. We have all kinds of stuff that are going to happen here during June. I hope that you came here, all of you tonight, feeling safe. Since we've been doing this June with so much rigor, I've discovered, sadly, that there are people who come here for events during June who do not feel safe and come to this place really with fear and trepidation. A number of years ago, a group called, and for those of you who've heard me tell this story before, I apologize, but there's a group called Gay and Sober that was created so people would have something to do, recovering people would have something to do on Pride Sunday. And in case you've never been to New York for Pride Sunday, it is a bacchanal. And they wanted to be able to gather in a way that was not about drug and alcohol. And so this guy got his friends together in his apartment, and that was the beginning of a group called Gay and Sober, which now has become, I think, national. So every year during Pride Week, they take over a hotel, and they all come together and have a sober Pride Week. But it culminates in this huge 12-step meeting, and they need a big room to do it in. And so they move from room to room to room around the city. It's never in the same place twice. So 3 or 4 years ago, they asked if we would host, and they did, and I came and welcomed people. And then my partner and I stayed for the 12-step meeting, and then we walked down the street to a little restaurant, a little hole in the wall, and we're having dinner, and a bunch of these guys came in. And I'd taken all this. I was no longer in my penguin suit, and this kid recognized me, though, and asked if I was not the priest at the cathedral. And he told me that he had been so abused as a gay kid in his youth that walking through those doors back there, he actually started to have a panic attack. He was physically, it hurt him to come into this space. And he only did it because all of his sober friends were coming, and he sort of tagged along. And he said that coming here and being treated like a dignified human being was for him a remarkable, Dan talked about this, of just a release of so much pain. It's what you do for people, a release of so much pain. And he said he couldn't wait to come back next year, and so that he could, be in this space again. And I said, well, the fact is you won't come back next year because it's at a different place every year. And he said, I'm going to start a petition. And they came back the next year, and they're coming back again this year. All of which is to say that the kindnesses that we do for people really can be transformative. If we just recognize the fact of how delicate, how sensitive people are, and how much we Christians have wounded people, really wounded them, and we can fix this. So, thank you, Dan, really. Thank you not just for being here tonight, but look, I've been watching you for a long time. I love your reels, and so it's really an honor for me that you're here. And thank you. Thank you for what you do. First of all, to put data over dogma, but especially what you do to use your platform for us gay people. So thank you.
I'm honored and humbled by that. Thank you.
So there's food, and there's drink, alcoholic and non, and there is a place where Dan is going to talk to you and sign books, and we're sorry that there were not more books. Blame St. Martin's, don't blame us. So, thank you.
Thank you, everybody.